Ryan Thompson leaned back in his worn-out desk chair, staring at the editing software on his computer screen. His latest video, another deep dive into some forgotten local legend, flickered across the monitor, but he could barely pay attention. His channel was stagnant. What used to feel thrilling, unearthing old myths and capturing creepy abandoned places on camera, now felt tired, dull. He rubbed his eyes, pushing away the fatigue that had been lingering for days. His small apartment in downtown Portland was cluttered with gear, camera equipment, notebooks filled with half-baked ideas, and a wall covered in printed maps and old newspaper clippings. Portland was a city known for its quirks, its history of strange happenings, and the dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever just beyond the city limits. It was the perfect backdrop for the kind of content he loved to create. But recently, something was off. The thrill was gone, and the viewers seemed to feel it too. The numbers weren't what they used to be. Ryan needed something big, something that would wake up his audience, and himself. That's when the email came. It was 2 a.m., and Ryan was one cup of coffee away from crashing at his desk when his inbox pinged. The subject line was vague, just "for you." No sender, no body text, just a single attachment, a video file. He hesitated for a second. Spam, probably. But curiosity was a beast he could never quite tame. He clicked it. The footage was grainy, dark. At first, it was hard to make anything out, just blurry movement and flickering light. But then, the image stabilized. A group of figures, at least a dozen of them, standing in a circle around a bonfire. They wore strange, animal-like masks, long, drooping ears, like rabbits, but grotesque. Their bodies were cloaked, but there was something wrong with the way they moved, jerky and unnatural, as if their limbs didn't quite fit together the right way. The camera jolted, zooming in on a massive stone statue at the center of the gathering. It was unlike anything Ryan had ever seen. The figure was monstrous, too tall. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a writhing mass of tentacles. The air around the stone seemed to pulse, alive somehow. The figures began to chant, a low, guttural noise that made Ryan's skin crawl. And then, the video cut to black. Ryan blinked at the screen, his heart racing, though he wasn't sure why. He tried to replay the video, but the file was corrupted, just static now. He refreshed his email, but the message was gone, no trace of it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the darkened screen. What the hell was that? Some kind of elaborate hoax? A prank? It didn't feel like one. The next day, Ryan couldn't shake the video from his mind. He found himself pulling out maps of the nearby forests, his fingers tracing the boundaries of the Tillamook Forest, a place known more for its hiking trails than anything sinister. But the deeper you went, the more remote it became. Miles of untouched wilderness where people occasionally went missing. Most were found. Eventually, some weren't. And then, there were the stories. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences in Tillamook, sightings of figures in the trees, of rituals held in secret groves. The deeper parts of the forest were said to be cursed, though no one could ever quite say why. Ryan had brushed off most of it as campfire tales, but now, after that video, he wasn't so sure. He called Samantha and Ethan, his closest friends and frequent collaborators. They had been with him on plenty of trips before, exploring abandoned buildings, hunting for ghosts in old, forgotten places. They were up for anything. "This might be the one, guys," Ryan said, pacing his cramped living room as they listened over speakerphone. "I think I've got something big. You remember those stories about the Tillamook Forest? The cult? The harvest?" There was a pause on the line before Samantha spoke, her voice skeptical. "Yeah, but those are just stories. No one's ever actually seen anything out there." "I got a video," Ryan said, lowering his voice, as if someone else could be listening. "Someone sent it to me last night. I don't know, it's like some kind of ritual. Masks, a huge stone statue. It felt real, Sam. Like, disturbingly real." There was a long silence. Then Ethan chimed in, excitement clear in his voice. "Dude, if this is legit, it could blow up. We could be the first ones to actually capture something out there." Ryan nodded, even though they couldn't see him. "Exactly. I say we go." Spend a few nights in the forest, film everything. Worst case, it's just another spooky camping trip. Best case, we capture something no one's ever seen before. Samantha was less enthusiastic. What if it's more than just a story, Ryan? I mean, there are reasons people don't go too far into those woods. There's a reason they call it the harvest. Her words hung in the air for a moment. Ryan had heard the rumors, the whispers about a group of people who had gone too deep, who would never come back. But those were just urban legends, weren't they? We'll be careful, Ryan assured her. We're always careful. The three of them agreed to meet at the edge of the forest that weekend. It was a last-minute trip, but they were all in. Ryan because he needed this, Ethan because he craved the adrenaline, and Samantha, well, she had a gut feeling this might not be such a great idea, but she couldn't let them go alone. The days leading up to the trip felt like a blur. Ryan couldn't focus on anything else. His mind kept drifting back to that statue, to the masked figures, to the chanting. He tried to find more information online, scouring forums, digging through old newspaper archives. He found scattered reports, people disappearing, sightings of strange rituals in the woods, but nothing concrete. And then, the night before they were set to leave, Ryan's phone buzzed with a new email. No subject line, no text, just another video attachment. His finger hovered over the screen, heart pounding in his chest. He clicked. The video was short, just a few seconds. Dark, shaky footage of the forest at night, the sound of heavy breathing, twigs snapping underfoot. The camera panned up, and there, between the trees, stood a figure, one of the masked men. But this time, the figure wasn't distant. He was close, too close. The camera zoomed in as the figure raised a hand, slowly pointing directly at the lens, and then, the video cut off. Ryan's stomach twisted into a knot. He could feel the sweat forming on his brow as he stared at the frozen frame of the video, the masked figure's finger still pointing toward him. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't a prank. Someone knew. They were watching. The drive to Tillamook Forest was long and quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like everyone was thinking too much and saying too little. Ryan sat in the back of Ethan's old Jeep, watching the trees blur past through the window. The tall pines stretched up into the gray sky, their shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower. It felt like the forest was swallowing them, the road narrowing as they left the city behind and plunged deeper into the wilderness. Samantha sat up front, staring out the windshield, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. She hadn't said much since they started the trip. Ryan could tell she was on edge, and honestly, he couldn't blame her. He'd watched the second video at least a dozen times before showing it to her and Ethan. Every time that masked figure's finger, pointing straight at the camera, sent a shiver down his spine. Someone knew they were coming. But who? And why? Ethan, of course, was unfazed. He had been talking non-stop for the first half of the drive, hyping up the trip like it was just another camping adventure. To him, this was nothing more than a thrill, a chance to capture something creepy, maybe go viral, and have a good story to tell afterward. But Ryan knew better. He had felt it the moment he opened that first email, the moment he saw those masked figures around the statue. This wasn't just some urban legend waiting to be debunked. There was something real lurking out there, and they were about to walk right into it. The forest felt different as they turned onto the dirt road that led to their campsite. The air was thicker, colder. The trees seemed older, gnarled, as if they had been standing there for centuries, watching, waiting. Ryan felt a familiar unease creep up his spine as they pulled into the clearing. "This is it," Ethan said, throwing the Jeep into park. He turned around, grinning at Ryan. "You ready to make some history?" Ryan forced a smile, though his stomach was already in knots. "Yeah, let's do this." The three of them piled out of the Jeep, stretching their legs after the long drive. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing tension in his chest. He needed to focus. This was their shot, and he couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. They set up camp quickly, working mostly in silence. The clearing was small, surrounded on all sides by towering trees that seemed to close in around them. Samantha lit the fire while Ethan unloaded the gear, setting up cameras on tripods to capture the campsite from every angle. Ryan pulled out his map, studying the terrain. According to the old reports, The strange sightings had been concentrated around a specific part of the forest, about 5 miles deeper in. That's where they would start tomorrow. Got it all mapped out? Samantha asked, sitting down next to the fire. Yeah, Ryan said, folding the map and tucking it into his jacket. We'll hike in tomorrow morning, see if we can find anything around the spot where the ritual supposedly took place. Ethan dropped down next to them, cracking open a beer. You think we'll actually find anything? Or is this just going to be another wild goose chase? Ryan shrugged. I don't know, but something's going on out here. You saw that video. Someone's out here and they don't want us to find them. Samantha shifted uncomfortably. I just hope we're not making a mistake. Ryan didn't say anything. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him agreed with her. There was something about this whole situation that felt wrong, like they were walking into a trap they couldn't see, but it was too late to back out now. They were committed. Tomorrow, they'd find out just how deep this thing went. That night, Ryan lay in his tent, staring up at the dark canvas above him. The sounds of the forest filled the air, leaves rustling in the wind, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. He tried to relax, to focus on the excitement of the adventure, but every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was that masked figure, standing silently in the trees, pointing straight at him. He didn't sleep much. The next morning, they packed up their gear and set off into the forest. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that made Ryan's skin crawl. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. After about 3 hours of hiking, they reached the area Ryan had marked on the map. It was a small clearing, not much different from where they had camped, but there was something unsettling about it. The trees around the edge of the clearing were twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent in unnatural ways. Strange symbols were carved into the bark, some of them so old they were barely visible, others fresh and sharp, like they had been cut into the trees recently. This is it, Ryan said, pulling out his camera. This is where they said the rituals happened. Samantha and Ethan stood silently, taking it all in. The air was colder here, despite the sun shining down on them. It felt wrong, like they didn't belong. We should set up some cameras, Ryan said, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. Document everything. Ethan nodded, but his usual enthusiasm had faded. He moved quietly, setting up the tripods and adjusting the angles, while Samantha stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the trees. Ryan turned on his camera and began filming, narrating as he walked through the clearing, pointing out the strange symbols, the twisted trees, the unsettling silence that seemed to hang over the place. Local legends say that this is where the cult, known as the Harvest, would gather for their rituals, Ryan said, his voice low as he filmed. The symbols carved into the trees are said to be part of the ritual, meant to summon something. No one knows exactly what, but people have reported seeing figures in the trees, strange creatures with masks that resemble animals, mostly rabbits. The locals say that if you see one, it means you're being watched, and once they've marked you, there's no escape. As the words left his mouth, Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. He had read the stories, heard the rumors, but being here, standing in the exact spot where these rituals supposedly took place, made everything feel much more real, too real. Let's get some more footage and head back to camp, Samantha said, her voice tense. I don't like this place. Ryan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around the clearing one last time before turning off his camera and packing up. The hike back to camp was uneventful, but the unease lingered. They didn't talk much, each of them lost in their own thoughts. By the time they reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. That night, as they sat around the fire, the atmosphere was different. The usual banter and joking around were gone, replaced by a tense silence. Even Ethan, who was always the first to crack a joke, seemed unusually quiet. You guys feel it too, right? Samantha asked, staring into the flames. Like, we shouldn't be here. Ryan nodded. He had felt it from the moment they arrived in the forest, but it was getting stronger. The sense that they were intruding, that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. We'll leave tomorrow, Ryan said. though he wasn't sure if he believed it. He had a feeling that whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. Later that night, Ryan woke with a start. At first, he wasn't sure what had woken him. The camp was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire outside his tent. He sat up, listening. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the trees just beyond the campsite. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly unzipped his tent and peered out into the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the clearing. The shadows of the trees loomed large and ominous, but there was nothing. No one. Ryan stepped out of the tent, his breath visible in the cold night air. The rustling sound came again, this time closer. He turned toward the tree line, his pulse quickening, and that's when he saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. The long ears of its rabbit mask were unmistakable, but the rest of its body was obscured by the darkness. It stood there, perfectly still, watching him. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. He stood frozen in place, unsure if he had actually seen it or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched, that creeping sense of dread, was stronger than ever. Ryan backed away from the trees and hurried back to his tent, his mind racing. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, his eyes fixed on the tent flap, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. The next morning, they packed up quickly, none of them saying much. Ryan didn't mention what he had seen the night before, not wanting to freak out Samantha or Ethan any more than they already were. But as they hiked out of the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that something was watching them from the shadows. When they finally reached the Jeep, Ryan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had made it out, but the sense of relief was short-lived. As they loaded up the gear, Ethan paused, frowning as he stared at one of the cameras. "Hey, did you guys see this?" he asked, holding up the camera. "The battery's dead, but it was fully charged when we left camp yesterday." Ryan frowned. "That's weird." Ethan nodded, flipping through the footage. "There's something here, though. Looks like it recorded part of last night." He hit play, and the three of them crowded around the small screen, watching as the camera's night vision kicked in. The clearing was bathed in an eerie green light, the trees looming like sentinels in the background. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just the fire crackling in the distance, the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, out of nowhere, the camera jerked, like something had bumped into it. The screen flickered, and for a split second, there was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A tall figure wearing a mask with long, drooping ears. And then, the camera cut to static. Ryan stared at the static on the camera screen, his heart pounding. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The clearing was dead silent around them, the only sound the faint rustling of the leaves in the wind. But to Ryan, it felt like the air itself was humming with tension. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. It was real. It wasn't just in his head. Samantha broke the silence first, her voice shaky. That was the same thing you saw, right? Last night." Ryan nodded, not trusting his voice. He felt like he was suffocating, trapped in the realization that they weren't alone out here, that something was watching them, playing with them. He hadn't wanted to believe it last night. Part of him had convinced himself it was a trick of the light, a nightmare he could wake up from, but the camera didn't lie. Ethan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "We should get out of here, now." Ryan couldn't agree more. He felt the overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something nagged at him, something deep in his gut that wouldn't let him leave just yet. "What about the statue?" Ryan asked, his voice low. Ethan stared at him like he had lost his mind. "Are you serious? You still want to keep going? After this?" Ryan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their stares on him. "Look, I know this is messed up, but we came all the way out here to find answers. We can't leave without knowing what's really going on." Samantha shook her head, fear clear in her eyes. "Ryan, we've already seen enough. We've seen too much. This is dangerous." Whatever those people are, they're not just some local weirdos playing dress-up. They're part of something real. I can feel it. Ryan looked from Samantha to Ethan, feeling the tension between wanting to leave and the irresistible pull of curiosity gnawing at him. They had come here for answers, and now they were closer than ever to finding out the truth. But at what cost? If we leave now, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper, we might never understand what this is. That statue, the rituals, the masks, it all means something, and it's happening right now, out there in those woods. We can't just turn our backs on it. Samantha opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a sound cut through the forest, the distinct crack of a branch snapping underfoot. All three of them froze, eyes darting to the tree line. The sound had come from somewhere close, too close. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the dense shadows between the trees, his heart racing so fast it felt like it might explode. And then he saw it, a figure, half hidden in the trees, standing perfectly still. The long, drooping ears of the rabbit mask were unmistakable, the black eyes behind the mask staring straight at them. But there was something else. The way it stood, the unnatural angle of its body, like it wasn't human anymore, like it was something else inside that mask, something wrong. Ethan cursed under his breath, backing away. No, nope, we're out of here. We're leaving. Right now. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Ryan's legs felt like lead, his mind screaming at him to run. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the thing in the trees, as if it was daring him to stay, daring him to take one more step deeper into the darkness. Ryan, Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. Please. The urgency in her voice snapped him out of his trance. He blinked, taking a shaky breath, and nodded. Okay, let's go. They turned and hurried back to the jeep, the sound of their footsteps too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. Ryan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the masked figure to be following them. But every time he looked, the woods were empty. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to him like a shadow. When they finally reached the jeep, Ethan wasted no time throwing their gear into the back and slamming the trunk shut. He jumped into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Come on, let's just go, he muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Ryan felt a momentary surge of relief as the jeep lurched forward, away from the clearing, away from the trees. But as they sped down the dirt road, the hairs on the back of Ryan's neck stood on end. He looked out the window, and through the trees, just for a second, he saw movement, a glimpse of something running alongside them, keeping pace with the jeep. His stomach dropped. It wasn't over. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the tension in the jeep thick enough to choke on. The forest seemed endless, the road winding through the trees like a labyrinth with no way out. Ryan kept checking his phone, but there was still no signal, no way to call for help. Ethan was the first to break the silence. Where the hell are we? We should have hit the highway by now. Ryan glanced at the GPS on the dashboard, but the screen was blank, the signal lost somewhere in the maze of trees. He tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at the back of his mind, but it was getting harder with every passing minute. The forest was changing around them, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. He swore they had passed that same crooked tree at least twice already. We're going in circles, Samantha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. We're not getting out. Ryan didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew she was right. The forest wasn't letting them go. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's impossible. There's only one road in and out of here. We'll find it. But the road just kept winding, leading them deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The light was fading fast, the shadows growing longer, and with it came a suffocating sense of dread. And then, just as the last light of the day was swallowed by the trees, the engine sputtered. Ethan swore under his breath, slamming his fist against the dashboard as the jeep lurched to a stop. What now? Ryan asked, his voice tight with fear. Ethan popped the hood and climbed out, cursing under his breath as he fiddled with the engine. Ryan and Samantha stayed inside, the silence between them thick with fear. Outside, the trees loomed, dark and silent, like they were waiting for something. Minutes passed, and Ethan slammed the hood shut with a frustrated sigh. I don't know what's wrong with it. It just died. Ryan's heart sank. They were trapped. No way to call for help, no way to leave, and night was falling fast. We can't stay here, Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to get out of here. Ryan nodded, his mind racing. The only option was to walk, but that meant going back into the forest, back into the dark. Ethan climbed back into the Jeep, his face pale. Okay, we'll grab the essentials and head out on foot. We can't be far from the highway. They packed quickly, grabbing what they could carry and leaving the rest behind. The forest was a wall of darkness around them, the silence thick and oppressive. Ryan's heart was pounding in his chest as they started down the road on foot, every shadow making his skin crawl. As they walked, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Ryan kept glancing over his shoulder, but the trees were empty, the shadows still. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a fork in the road. Ethan paused, frowning as he looked between the two paths. This wasn't here before, he muttered. We didn't pass this on the way in. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. The forest was changing around them, leading them deeper into the maze. There was no way out. We have to keep moving, Samantha said, her voice trembling. We can't stop now. Ethan nodded, and they chose the left path, hoping it would lead them to safety. But as they walked, the darkness seemed to thicken, the trees pressing in closer, their branches whispering in the wind. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth and decay filling Ryan's lungs. And then, in the distance, Ryan saw it. A faint glow through the trees, flickering like firelight. Do you see that? He whispered, pointing ahead. Samantha and Ethan turned, their eyes widening as they spotted the glow. Maybe it's a campsite, Ethan said, his voice hopeful. Maybe there are people out there who can help us. But Ryan wasn't so sure. There was something unnatural about the light, something that made his stomach twist with dread. We should go the other way, Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. We shouldn't get any closer. But Ethan was already moving toward the light, his steps quick and determined. Ryan and Samantha exchanged a look, then followed him, their footsteps silent in the thick underbrush. As they got closer, the glow grew brighter, and soon they could hear the sound of chanting, low and rhythmic, carried on the wind. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the edge of a clearing, and then they saw it. A massive stone statue stood at the center of the clearing, its surface covered in moss and strange, writhing symbols. The figure was monstrous, towering above them with long, twisting tentacles where its face should have been. It looked alive, as if it was just waiting to wake from its slumber. Around the statue, the figures in the rabbit masks stood in a circle, their bodies moving in eerie synchronization as they chanted in a language that made Ryan's skin crawl. Samantha gasped, and one of the masked figures turned toward them, its black, empty eyes locking onto theirs. Ryan's blood ran cold. They had found the heart of the ritual, and now they were part of it.